already said it. Allow God to touch you first. It needs to begin with you. My journey, I wish my journey was more like others I've heard give testimony. My journey with the Lord, I as a young pastor, had a great church. Things were going well. Ended up very wounded. I'd gone to Toronto, got touched by the Holy Spirit, came back. Things were going great. My denomination rejected me. We had trouble, and I ended up resigning from that church. I thought, I'm going to go work in our Bible college. It's easier to tell people how to do it than it is to do it. That was my thinking. I'll go shape minds rather than be the one that's out there on the front line. And I remember driving out of Clearwater, Florida, and I'm not proud of this at all, but I'd loaded up the U-Haul truck, and I drove out of Clearwater, Florida, and I told the Lord out loud, I said, Lord, I will never be on the cutting edge of what you're doing again. And I would have gone to heaven after that. I was living for the Lord after that, but it was the driest 4 years of my life. I mean, it was just like there was nothing there. And I ended up back in Florida, and ended up pastoring again, and church was doing great. Church was growing, setting records, amazing time. But my wife looked at me and she said, you could leave this church and never shed a tear. You have a wall built up. And I got upset with her. I said, that's not true. I love this church. I love the people. I'm a good pastor. She said, you could leave this church and never shed a tear. You've built a wall around your heart. And I began to think about it, and I realized that she was right. Now, I didn't tell her she was right. I wasn't going to confess that to her, but I realized that she was right. And then that was about the time the Brownsville revival broke out, and I had people going to the Browns revival. And it was making me angry because they would come back and tell me, Pastor, you've got to go to Brownsville. You've got to go there. Revival is there. Now, what I was hearing them say was, Pastor, what you have is not good enough. You need to go somewhere and get something else. Now, made me angry. Now, they were right. I didn't know they were right. But they were right. I remember that there was a young guy who didn't halfway live for the Lord. Wednesday night, I'm standing teaching. He walks in at the back as I finish. He didn't come to hear me teach that night. And he walks down, he goes up to me and says, Pastor, I love you. You've got to go to Brownsville. And so I did what most pastors would do. I gave him a good theological answer. I said, God is omnipresent. God is here just as much as he is there. And if he wants to touch me, he can touch me here. I don't have to go anywhere to get something else. All true theology. God is omnipresent. He was there. But I went home that night. I said, sweetheart, I'm going to go to the revival so I can tell them I've already been. I didn't go to get anything. I really didn't. I went so I could tell them I've been there, done that, bought the t-shirt, now leave me alone. I didn't go with any expectancy. So I drove over. It was like a 9-hour drive where I lived in southern part of Florida. And I got there and decided not to go to church that night. I think it was Thursday night football or something was on that I wanted to watch, so I didn't go. And then I found out, they told me, said, you got to go early and get in line in order to get a seat in the main sanctuary, or you have to sit in the overflow. Who stands in line to go to church? They don't stand in line in my church. But I wanted to make sure that I experienced all of it, so I got up and I drove on the parking lot. And I pulled under this big oak tree that they had at that point in time. And as I put my SUV into park, the Lord got in the car with me. I call it my parking lot experience. And the Lord took my heart in his hands, and he began to squeeze, and he began to squeeze, and I began to shake, and I'm weeping, and I'm crying. And I had no grid for it. I had no understanding of revival, renewal, or anything. I don't know what's happening to me. I'm thinking, am I having a nervous breakdown? And I'm just having this experience that lasted for maybe 45 minutes in the car. And I didn't know that everybody else was as much a wreck as I was. I didn't know that. I could have driven home at that moment. I didn't need anything else. God touched my life at that moment. But I got out, got in line. I realized everybody's a wreck. Went in. I don't remember what anybody preached on. I don't know what Michael Brown said. I don't know what Steve Hill preached on. Nobody prayed for me. I got in my car and drove home. And on the way home, I put together my first sermon on revival as I was driving, called the 10 Pillars of Revival. And I got up on Sunday morning and I preached. It was a horrible message, by the way. Never preached it since then. But it was called the 10 Pillars of Revival. But I was excited about revival. And I stood and announced to our church, I said, we're going to be a church that's going after God. That's going to be the priority of our church from now on. I wish I could say that everybody went. Everybody didn't go. But we grew in spite of those who left. We were one of those churches that grew. In fact, after we got involved with renewal, we set an attendance record every year and set a financial record every year after we got involved in renewal. And I remember the time that my board called me to take me out. We didn't have many restaurants where I was pastoring, but we had a Denny's. As they wouldn't take me out for dinner at Denny's, and I thought they've never invited me out before. So I realized that something was up. This is probably 6 or 8 months into it. And the spokesperson, a man who I'd recently performed his wedding, he was a good friend, he looked at me and he said, Pastor, you weren't like this when we hired you. And I told him, I said, Tom, I wasn't like this when you hired me. I said, but God has touched me again and I'm never going back. I can't give up what I have. And I said, you've got to decide. You have to decide whether you want to be a people that's going after God. I said, because I'm not changing it. I'm not going back the way it was for me. And I lost half of my board, but it was the Lord sent people for me that stepped into those places. So I had to let it begin with me. Now, you may not be the pastor, but let it begin with you. And we ended up being very much involved in renewal and revival and relationship with many of those who were involved in it. But let it start with you. And then last, and this is the last thing I'm going to cover because I'm running out of time, but just be open to the things that we don't understand. Now, if you're here and you're new to this, don't worry about it. Just be open to the things you don't understand. I did not like any of the manifestations. Even after I was involved in renewal, I did not like them. Oh, I didn't like that. I mean, which I do now, but I just didn't like those things. I didn't like any of the manifestations. I didn't like the shaking. I didn't like the scrum that they did at the Toronto. I didn't like. The first time I heard Heidi Baker speak, I thought, "Oh, Jesus, help me through this." I closed my eyes because she was on her back most of the time. Oh, and I thought, until the altar time got there, and then I'd run down to the altar. But be open to the things you don't understand. I struggled with every aspect. I hated the laughter. I did. I hated the laughter. I remember to this day the first time somebody laughed in my church. His name was Charlie. He was one of my elders. We were trying to build this building. The county didn't want us to build a building. They said, they actually told me to my face, we don't need another big church in your area. We were just trying to build a 45,000 square foot addition. And they just said, we don't need another big church in this area. And so, here they come, 4 of them, line up across on the right-hand side on a Sunday night to check us out. Charlie's sitting in front of him, and that's the night that Charlie decides to have a laughing fit. Really. He actually ends up jumping up, run down the altar, rolling around, laughing in the floor. And I know I'm turning red with anger. We've not had any laughter in the church. Now, we've seen it at Toronto and other places, but now remember, I've already gone to Toronto, but we hadn't had it in our church. So Charlie goes out that door, I go out the middle door, and I catch him. And I told him, I said, Charlie, we don't do that here. And we ended up staying good friends, and he stayed on the elders board. He said, I understand, Pastor. I didn't realize that what I was saying was, Charlie, come and be depressed, but please don't come and be joyful. I didn't make the connections. So I struggle with the laughter. Now, now I'm going to Toronto often, just often as I can go. And I had this trouble. Maybe you're like me. I was always trying to get one of the main speakers to pray for me. And I never could. Really, I went to Brownsville. I can't tell you how many times, Toronto. And at Toronto, I'd strategize. I'd wait and see which line the main speakers were going to go to, and I'd go squeeze in on their line. You had to go get in the line. And literally, they would go down more, touching people. They would get to me and go the other way. This sounds like an exaggeration. I had them skip me, or they would get almost to me and somebody would come get them by the arm to take them off. It became a joke with my friends. They said, you have written on your forehead, do not lay hands on. Really. So this goes on for years, really years. And so we were at a conference, me and two pastor friends from Florida, and I'd given up on trying to strategize. I'm just sitting in the line, and somebody with no name comes by and prays for me. And, I feel the presence, so I'm laying on the floor. And I'd given up on some things that were prophesied over my life in the 80s. And as I'm laying there, the Lord begins to bring those things back to my mind. And I shook my head and I said, no, Lord, no. I don't want to go through that again. And then I said, if this is you, Lord, give me a sign. That's all I said. So I get up, and I'm about to walk back to my seat. And all of a sudden, this girl taps me on the shoulder and says, come with me. Carol wants to pray for you. And I thought, finally, someone has discernment. And Carol was on the other side of the building. I still to this day don't know why she picked me out. So I go over, and this time, Carol reaches out and touches me, and it's not I get, this nice little swoon. I'm knocked to the floor, and then she does the strangest thing. She puts her foot on me in the middle of my chest, and that's how she prays for me. I'm wondering, where's this foot been? So she's praying with me with her foot in the middle of my chest, and she's talking to people, and I'm just sitting there, laying there thinking, this is sort of unusual, and then all of a sudden, it begins to bubble up. From right here. The next thing I know, I am rolling back and forth with this hilarious laughter, just this gut-wrenching laughter just rolling out of me, and it just keeps going. And this lasts for 3 or 4 minutes, and people on both sides trying to keep me from rolling over people. And then all of a sudden it lifts, and then the Lord spoke to me. He said, the very thing that you despised has now become a sign to you. I'm going to do what I said I was going to do.